This evening's talk's about Syria, and the situation there is desperate. The politics of it are very complex, both internally and externally. It's an enormous pleasure to have Rana Kabbani, the Syrian writer and broadcaster, with us this evening. And without more ado, I'm going to hand over to her, and she's going to talk about the situation in Syria at the moment, and maybe what the future holds.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Being of the old left myself, and very much a long family tradition, I found it impossible to live in Britain, where I had decided to come and integrate when I had to leave Syria. When Tony Blair decided that he was going to create something called New Labour, which to me seemed nothing but old conservatism. In any event, I went to live in Paris for a while, and when friends would ask me why I liked France, I would say that it was because it was a country that could still create, write, and support a newspaper like Le Monde Diplomatique, with the seriousness and the extraordinary diversity and erudition about so many subjects of the world. The pieces that stay in my mind most profoundly are the ones not at all about the Middle East, but about Indonesia, where I grew up. I grew up there because I came from a family of career diplomats who had been very much part of the representation of Syria after independence from the French. And because they were from bourgeois backgrounds, they were all sent on hardship posts when the Ba'ath took power in 1963. And therefore my father was sent to Indonesia. Now we arrived there, and it was the year that Suharto was put in power by military coup by the United States in one of the most horrific interventions by the United States anywhere in the world. And the consequences of that intervention had terrifying consequences for not only communists, but every possible kind of dissent in that country that was stilled forever as it was made into a market for American goods and American policies in Southeast Asia. And I think Le Monde Diplomatique wrote about that better than anybody else did. The time I was shocked reading this favorite paper of mine was a few years ago, and soon after Bashar al-Assad came to power, when Alain Grèche, who was then its editor and for many years the sort of guiding spirit of the paper, wrote about Assad in an interview that was, I thought, as sycophantic as the appalling piece we saw in Vogue 2 years ago. And the reason he did that was because, although someone who should know better, coming from a long tradition of real socialist struggle and real understanding of what countries go through when they have grave disruptions of class and grave changes economically and politically, he nevertheless seemed to find it quite easy and seductively simple to fall for the Assad sort of presentation, as we know now, very much created by publicity companies, including in the United States, that idea that Assad was a reformer, that he was someone who was a secularist, someone who looked like one of us, someone who seemed to be very much part of the Middle East that we all aspired to creating. Now, I only mention this not because I want to attack Gresh personally, but because it has become one of the staples of the way Syria has been reported and talked about, and the Assad regimes have been reported and talked about for almost the better part of 30 years, since the idea that Hafiz Assad, the founder of this mafia clan, because I can't call it anything else, decided in his crushing of the Muslim Brotherhood's rebellion, which started in the 80s and was brought under brutal control with the devastation to people's lives that you all know about in 1982 in Hama. He became the man who was able to stop Muslim fundamentalists in its tracks. This became an argument of great weight and importance when Americans started feeling, and many other Western powers started feeling, that all manifestations of political Islam had to be defeated there and then, and that there could never be any engagement of any sort with those kinds of representations. And it was almost a kind of oppositional battle, which again showed itself not only curiously enough in the engagement between the United States and the rest of the world, and especially the Muslim world, but between the old USSR and its Muslim republics, and even later Russia and its relations with the newly independent so-called Muslim republics. Now, so I have great difficulties with that particular viewpoint, not because I am myself a Muslim fundamentalist, but because I am very, very aware of what role Islamic movements played in the liberation of countries in the Middle East, both from Britain and France, including the petit bourgeois sort of almost natural piety, if you call it, of the souk, where in the 20s and 30s certainly the fight against French colonialism was very much concentrated. My own grandfather, who was one of the merchants of the Damascene souk, and who was a self-made man and who had become wealthy in the years since he settled in Damascus, became highly involved in the struggle against the French, and he and his colleagues in the souk would have strikes that have gone down in Syrian history as being highly emotive and reminiscent of a period when certainly merchants would give blood and treasure to fight for a cause they believed in and for the kind of liberation of their country and people from oppression, whether it was external or not. And this comes in the wake of the first great Syrian Revolution of the earlier part of the century against the last years of the Ottoman Empire, when nationalism had reared its ugly head in Turkey, and that had taken the form in the Young Turk movement of rather vicious racism against Arabs, and even against those Arab elites that had once run the Ottoman Empire in places like Iraq, like Syria, like Egypt, and Palestine. I remember the story of my great-grandmother, who had been one of the early suffragettes in Syria and who had gone to Istanbul to study, which was quite unheard of at the time among women of her class and generation, and had come back and decided that she would tear off the veil in public, as so many people, as so many women had done in other countries, like in Egypt with the famous Huda Sha'rawi. During that period of highly repressive measures by the Young Turks, this young woman, who had been one of the brilliant girls in her class, was called up by the Turkish inspectress who had come from Istanbul to see the school. And she said to her in Turkish, of course that generation was completely fluent in that language, she said to her, "Oh, you are wonderfully lovely, and you've written such a beautiful essay. And what is your name?" So she said her name, Selwa Ghazi, and the Turkish inspector looked at her in horror, and she said to her in utter disdain, sort of flinging her hand at her like that to make her go away, she said, "Ah, you're an Arab." So that kind of feeling led to Syrians deciding that the time for the Ottoman Empire had finished, and that they would start their first rebellion against what they came to see as foreign control. Now, this history comes back to haunt us today as Syrians, because having seen the Turks off and having seen the French off after a long and bitter struggle, which including the bombing of Damascus twice and the destruction of its most prosperous civilian quarter, which is to this day called Ar-Raqqah, which means the fire, and again visions of families, including my mother's, who came out of their houses carrying babies and really nothing else, because their city was being shelled by the French. And it's really fascinating for me to know that the first protest in Syria 2 months before Daraa broke out in Haria, and it's as though that part of old Damascus still retained, despite 42 years of Assad deformation of all values, it still retains some memory, perhaps even just in the name, of the ability to say no to oppression, whether it was an external colonialism or an internal one, which I think most Syrians now feel the Assad regime has been.